Good day. My name is Tom Axworthy. I am Public Policy Chair here at Massey College at the University of Toronto. And I want to welcome you to today's discussion on the ethics of protests. How far is too far? But I want to begin first by our land acknowledgement that Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron Wendat and the Hattushanis peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have at Massey College to work on this land. So, today, ladies and gentlemen, on our topic on the ethics of protest, civil disobedience and protest have been one of the great traditions of democracy. The protests give voice to the voiceless and those who are not connected, those who cannot have lobbyists make their points felt with their feet and their collective attempts to change our society for the better. And some of the great democratic heroes in the past century, like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, thinkers from the 19th century like Thoreau, have worked out a whole program on why protest is essential to our functioning of democracy. And indeed, freedom of association, freedom of assembly is guaranteed in Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this is a well-established right with a long history. But a right is not a license. The Charter also, in Section 1, which guarantees our rights, also has reasonable limits on the exercise of those rights to protect public safety and to ensure that while you are voicing your point of view, you are not preventing someone else from their own freedom of assembly. And so we meet at a time when there are debates everywhere in the world, but certainly in this country, about the ethics of protest, the responsibilities of governing authorities to ensure that this democratic right can be exercised, but also the ethics of the protesters themselves. What are their internal morals to ensure that protest doesn't become intimidation, let alone generate violence? So this is a very contentious area, but very timely. And I'm delighted to welcome to this panel Bob Haverlock, a theologian and artist who has used his art to try to raise consciousness about the environment in general and water in particular. Emily Hines is the director of the Forum for the Leadership on Water in the country and a well-known environmental activist as well, who's playing an important part in an important organization on this theme. And Peter Slowly is the change maker in residence at Massey College and Ottawa's former police chief. So a man who has direct hands-on experience on that very difficult balance that police forces have to make in ensuring multiple rights of, of protesters, but also of the general society. So welcome all, and thank you for joining us at Massey College. So, Bob, I'd like to start with you. Uh, Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it leads toward justice. And I reread his letter from Birmingham jail, as preparation for this session, where King went out of his way to make the point on how important protest was against unjust laws as a means to draw attention and to try to persuade a majority that there was an abuse that needed redressing. So I wanted to turn it to you for your perspective, but also some now wonder whether the values of King and Gandhi and others, are they now outmoded? Have they been superseded? Is that arc of that moral universe still bending toward justice?
Well, thanks, Tom, for inviting me to be part of this good company to muse on the theme of ethics and protest. Um, at first I thought the focus would be on Ottawa's ongoing troubling protests of those who arrive in chauffeured limousines to meet at the Rideau Club and talk to the deputy minister and to protest the inadequate subsidies for oil and gas industry, or perhaps to protest insufficient arrests at Wet'suwet'en by the RCMP, but much influenced by our society's ways of seeing and thinking. I return to focus on those with restricted access that Martin Luther King and Gandhi and others were key in leading into protests in public spaces in uh, not only forceful but imaginative ways, in ways that engaged the public in gentle in many ways and yet striking fashion. And I want to begin by recalling an incident from decades ago, a couple of decades ago, uh, of an exemplary public protest that I think is something of a model. Uh, Lima, Peru. It was outside President Fujimori's office overlooking Parliament Square. With it, busy market stalls, citizens sitting and visiting in the square. And recall that Fujimori's corrupt regime had a history of handing over natural resources for transnational corporate exploitation, and his sanctioning paramilitaries and their vigorous uh, and murderous, often, violence against peasants and allies who opposed these ventures. This protest in the Great Square began with a group of actors, theoretically, pardon me, theatrically setting out a large laundry tub, pails of water, then a clothesline, with a shirt, blouse, underwear. And after pouring pails of water into the tub, they took turns shaking in lots of soap for all to see. Next, holding up a large scrub board and a dirty looking laundry bag. From this, they slowly took out the flag of Peru, then began scrubbing and scrubbing the flag before ceremoniously hanging it on the line. This quiet scream of a protest was unmistakable. Indeed, it was repeated 20, 20 times in front of Peruvian embassies around the world. Now, the protesters hadn't broken any laws by burning the flag. Instead, they imaginatively used an iconic archetypal act of care, of love, washing. In so doing, this protest fixed eyes on dirty government practices represented by the flag, and not on the protesters as such. Often, as you've suggested, Tom, the protesters' behavior becomes the issue. Mm-hmm. The challenge for protest is to maintain the eye on the issue itself, mm-hmm, so that it's not lost altogether by the behavior of the protesters. Now, of course, in formulaic media reporting of protests, often the dramatic, destructive moments that may occur acts of a few are what gets attention. But in any case, the media has to be engaged. It's inseparable from what the protest will often come to mean. Mm-hmm. So part of the protest strategy has to be alert to that. This points to the need for effective protests, I think, to creatively catch the imagination of media and intended observers and the public, who are not just onlookers, but are either potential allies or opponents. But how to do this without going too far? To the question, in matter of ethics and protest, how far is too far? To respond to this question, we need a shared sense of ethics in particular cases. It's a little problematic. I would suggest that Aristotle's political ethics may give us some guidance. Recall, his ethics are part of his philosophy of the political realm. For his desired happiness of the ethical person is understood to be in relationship to others in the society at large. This is guidance for each protester. Therefore, the ethical person is a full citizen. The ethical person seeks the well-being of the society as a whole for Aristotle, and not just privileges for themselves and a few. A good guide. So not just my liberty, me and mine, oblivious to equality and fraternity, those building blocks. Now, Aristotle's ideal just citizen seeks laws and policy that are for the entire societies, the larger well-being, and this would inform, shape public protests. Now, I want to argue that ethical protest ought to more often become creative protest. And recall the time of the arrests in Selma, how the protesters began singing, much to the surprise of onlookers in those early days. They sang on the way to the police wagon, they sang in jails, they sang in the streets. So, creative protest, it communicates in ways that entice and can nurture participation in seeking just policies, a just society. Now, here's the rub, and integral to the just society are the laws. The laws which help give the possibility of peaceful participation, all in the flow of social and economic life at its best. But when the laws are too far from their best and are unjust, destructive to the political life that maintains the good possibilities of life, then protesting unjust laws becomes the just citizen's task, a task ideally protected by law. But again, each particular case, of course, needs brooding over, and law breaking is understood not to be taken lightly. Mm-hmm. However, to avoid the derailment of protest actions by arrests, which occasionally may be an objective, there is wisdom in imaginative protests, surprising and engaging, that go far, but not too far. Here, an ethics of protest that wants to spark society's engagement, we might well muse over the aesthetics of protest. And that takes us back to such imaginative, artful protest actions as our Peru flag washing example, and a closing drawing I offer you on this theme direction. It reads, "In these times when the powers are not listening, protesters must speak spoof to power, use the force of farce, precipitate the double take, and perhaps we may, by indirection, direction find." Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. When you're discussing creative protests, I'm just reminded of Saul Alinsky, who was one of the great organizers in the 50s and 60s, and wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, which was a primer, really, for protests and demonstrations from that era and continuing. But he always tried to emphasize the creativity of protest. And one of his most successful efforts was with Mayor Daley, who was no slouch in Chicago. Alinsky worked in Chicago. And the administration had been very slow to provide health inspection and sanitation in a given area that Alinsky was working. So he came up with a very creative protest. He called it Share the Rats. And he organized 1,000 live rats that he would deliver to to City Hall.
Yeah, yeah.
You won't be surprised that very quickly the health inspectors and the sanitation folks arrived
Yes,
out in Woodlawn. But
good example. Yeah.
the creativity of protest. Emily, I'd like to turn to you now. In your position in Flow, which is a research entity and a think tank, and it tries to persuade by research and working with decision makers. But the environmental movement, of course, has starting with Earth Day many so long ago, and Greenpeace, which began with nuclear testing and Chitka, and thinking more currently of Greta Thunberg, who at 15 began protesting outside of the Swedish Parliament, uh, calling for a school strike for climate change, and within a year or two, this 15-year-old, I think there were 4 million students protesting on Fridays against climate change. You know, quite an amazing before COVID, the way that this direct action caught the attention. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Your job now is working to try to persuade decision makers. People like Greta are working on the outside to raise consciousness. I'm very interested in your perspective.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's very interesting because I think I'm living in the realm of what happens after the protest. And I really like to see what the follow through is. So it's safe to say we are living in a climate emergency, and we all know this. Often in Canada, climate protests ask for federal action and meaningful change. We've been inspired by Greta's Fridays for Future protests that you mentioned, and we are really blessed now to have a young population that is aware of the issues and demanding change frequently. But so far, we've seen very little meaningful action at the federal and international levels. Based on the climate protests of the 70s, many of which led to successful legislative changes and implementation, such as the Clean Air Act in the US, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and the Montreal Accord, the asks were much more direct. We have a lot more issues now that have bigger, harder solutions. Now, protests need attention, going back to what Bob said as well. But protests need attention, information, expertise, and notably follow through. We are battling an attention economy that we've never seen before that leaves very little opportunity for lasting impact and ongoing support. It's not just about getting featured on the news or across social media platforms. It's about getting into the federal agenda and the national consciousness. This is the most important part of climate protests, utilizing the window of opportunity, either that you have created or that has opened due to different things like natural disasters, and following through on asks and solutions. It's making climate change a top tier election issue and a topic of significance on the national and international stage. Climate protests can encourage the government to lead with the knowledge that there is public pressure behind them. Without the pressure, nothing happens. So going to your question about the youth movement and then ideas of what like Flow does and what we do, I would say it's easy. It can be said, no protest, no pressure, no action. I think a great example of this on a smaller level is the 15 Canadian youth who are suing the government for failing to protect them from the impacts of climate change, a breach of the Charter of Rights. They have said numerous times that this is not about money. This is about drawing attention at the federal level that will lead to legislative change and action, which they have already seen through similar court cases in France and Germany. To end, the climate crisis is here. We are already living it. We do not have the time that we had in the 70s to get ready and prepare for the 1.5 degrees warming. Yes, this is scary, but it's also motivating. We must create lasting change now. And to leave you with this quote from Greta that I love, that I haven't seen around as much as her others, is that this is not the time to be nice. So I'm excited to hear from the other panelists and discuss and learn from these members on how our society can leverage protest to a greater degree. But just to end, I think the follow through is what makes protest truly great. So thank you.
Well, and of course, her famous speech that the world is on fire when this teenager spoke to world leaders. But her career then also leads then into the next perspective in turning to Peter, because in recent weeks or months, I've read Greta herself has been arrested and almost has been seeking out arrests in the way to draw even more attention, has been fined and so on, just making the point that she is, like Martin Luther King and others, willing to have civil disobedience and pay the price. So, Peter, it so often then falls to our police forces, as I said in my introduction, that the rights of protesters are a democratic right, and rights within the charter have to be protected. But at the same time, there are a host of other issues that these rights aren't paramount. There are issues of public safety. There are the rights of others. And it falls to our police forces so often to try to get that balance right in real time, at the time, enormously difficulty. So I'd like to hear your perspective as someone who's been on the front line, but also I know that for our Massey audience, they may not be aware of what are the requirements for protest. Does one have to seek, and it may change by municipality or province, but seek out a permit? Do you inform the police beforehand? I mean, you're going to be closing down streets. Is there a set of agreed procedures before a protest or a parade can begin? It may sound like a simple question, but I don't think a lot of people know.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate the kind introduction. I will touch on the issue of permitting briefly in my presentation, and certainly can do a deeper dive as we get into the discussion. But first, let me begin by thanking Massey College for coordinating this timely session on the ethics of protest. And I'm grateful to you, Tom, for inviting me to be a panel member, and enjoy being with such an excellent group of experts. And certainly I've learned a lot even in the other two presentations. Finally, I appreciate the time that people have taken to view and participate in this event, whether live or we'll take the time in the future to look at it online. I certainly agree the ability for people to gather and engage in protests, demonstrations, and other such events is charter protected, and more importantly, is a critical element of a healthy, functioning democracy. To be clear, as a Canadian, I have personally and professionally benefited from this protected right in so many ways over so many years. There are many types of protests that Canadian police deal with on a daily basis. First, lawful and safe events. These are permitted events where no protester breaks a municipal, provincial, or federal law, and such events occur daily across Canada with little to no police involvement or media coverage. Next, there are lawful but unsafe events, and these are permitted events that may involve, for example, a polarizing figure or a polarizing issue that draws large crowds, could be confronted by counter-protests, and or could result in unsafe crowd dynamics, such as overcrowding with the potential for crowd spillover onto streets and or the interference with critical infrastructure. Third broad type would be unlawful but safe. These might be non-permitted events, events where protesters breach one or more laws, but the event is coordinated to such a degree that there are no dangerous crowd dynamics. These might be spontaneous events based on local or geopolitical issues that take place in front of embassies, government buildings, and the like. And last, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but last for me, unlawful and unsafe events. These would be non-permitted protests with significant legal breaches, low levels of coordination, high levels of polarization, and inevitably will involve dangerous crowd dynamics, including counter-protests, and we've seen them unfold at large political conventions, economic and geopolitical summits, etc. It should be noted that almost every protests are dynamic. These are dynamic events that can change quickly from safe to unsafe, from lawful to unlawful, and vice versa. In the past, police have handled the vast majority of these events well. That said, the nature of protests is changing in terms of complexity, frequency, and intensity, while the abilities of the police and other democratic institutions, civil society actors, to manage these protests lawfully, effectively, and safely, those abilities are diminishing. This diminishing situation has degraded significantly over the past decade because of the following main reasons, and this is not an exhaustive list. The erosion of trust in society, not just with governments, police, and other institutions, but in all aspects of society. The post-pandemic period, where we have seen come to the forefront, not just in the media, but in large social consciousness of systemic socioeconomic issues, systemic discrimination, and generally increased stressors on systems and people. Increasingly polarized Canadian society, largely due to the collective impact of social media and its echo chamber effects, the increased impact of misinformation and disinformation campaigns, increasingly on social media, and unfortunately, AI enabled. Butterfly effect. This is where an issue or a crisis anywhere in the world can result in a protest or demonstration anywhere in Canada in near real time. And then finally, for me, the structural deficits in Canadian policing and other democratic institutions. We have 20th century institutions that can't keep pace with 21st century demands. There are many factors that determine the relative lawfulness and safety of such events, but primarily they rest on the level of co-planning, coordination, cooperation, communication, and cohesion between and within the protest organizers, the police, and the local civil society leaders and other actors. I'll conclude my comments with this March 5th quote from the London Met Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. Quote, "We're always operating in a very challenging political environment where tensions remain high, and hate crime is still a long way above pre-October 7 levels. Policing is used to being criticized, but where it isn't justified, I do worry about the impact it has on our officers and staff and on public confidence as we strive to operate without fear and favor. At the moment, one side of the debate seems to say that we are guilty of two-tier policing, and the other side says we are oppressive and clamping down on the right to freedom of speech. In this context of polarized public debate, I do think sometimes we're the first people who are able to be labeled simultaneously woke and fascist. I hope this helps to stimulate good questions and a high-quality discussion on this important topic. And thank you again, Tom.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter. And that was a very interesting inventory of the differing kinds of protests and so on that police have to deal with. I read in 2019 the Association of Police Chiefs a very interesting report on manuals, really a framework for dealing with assemblies and demonstrations. And there they talked about the key strategies pre-protest, during the protest, and post-protest. And their main point being that policing, their recommendation, had to change and evolve by creating police liaison committees to work with protesters beforehand and to try to learn about the leaders of the protests so that if problems were emerging, they could occur without having arrests. If I can begin just the second round, do you think there is then some major changes in the theories of policing on dealing with this since over the past decades? We could all point to previous models where it seemed that enforcement was the major preoccupation. Reading this report is very different when they're talking about liaison committees to establish trust before it begins.
Tom, for me, that document in 2019, and I was the chief in Ottawa at that point, was a next step iteration of a theme and best practice that had been in existence in my entire time in policing, which goes back to the late 1980s. In fact, as a rookie cop, when I was being recruited by the Toronto Police Service, probably the one part of the entire months-long recruitment process was a question put to me by the recruiting sergeant at an interview where back then the Morgenthau news around protests and demonstrations. And the question was put to me, what's your religious background, which is probably a not appropriate question. But as I said, a Roman Catholic, he said, well, as a Roman Catholic and as a police officer with the Toronto Police Service, how would you handle your assignment to that set of demonstrations? And, that comes to the heart of the ethics of protest and the ethics of policing within those protest contexts. So the essence of that comes down to your ability to carry out your purpose, which is to keep the peace in balance with upholding the law, while also being in balance of protecting the rights of individuals and promoting an effective democracy through the protection of those rights. And that has remained as complex in 1988 when that question was put to me as it is now in 2024, and even more complex for the reasons why I outlined. I think the 2019 document has actually become overquoted and overused. At the heart of effective policing, going back into the 1800s, is the winning and the maintenance of public trust in any form of public safety and in any aspect of policing. Public trust is at the heart of public safety. So whether you call them liaison officers, or as we did in my day in the 90s and 2000s, meeting and greeting officers that literally would go out in advance of a protest, meet and greet with all arriving protesters earlier, try to establish a relationship with organizers, try to understand to the extent that the organizers are willing to share information. Who is coming? What's the run of play going to be? Where do you need policing supports? Where are you concerned about policing activity? And through that opening negotiation and dialogue, create a level of trust, a level of cooperation and collaboration that I talked about in my presentation. And that, more than any other factor, quite frankly, is what I think determines the relative level of lawfulness and safety within these events. I hope I've answered the question, but happy to take another run at it if need be.
Good, excellent. Okay, Emily, you made the point that the issue of protest or trying to change public opinion on the priority of these issues was so critical to set the stage to try to change the legislative framework and actually get work done. What is your estimation now? I'm just very interested with all the work that has been done in terms of trying to raise consciousness around climate change. And in his own way, Bob's been working on that. And we have mutual friends who've spent their life trying to do that. But is there a sense of frustration now that issues like the carbon tax are so polarized? 99 out of 100 economists would have said 3 or 5 years ago that's exactly the right way to go, and now it's an issue everywhere, and it seems to be losing a lot of public ground. So with protest and public consciousness, yet we're starting to fall behind, are we not? Or am I mistaken in that?
I think we're not falling behind. I think that people are getting fatigued by these conversations. And I think something that Peter said is that with these echo chambers and the butterfly effect, that people are being inundated with crises all the time. So, especially around climate. So, when you have like the carbon tax conversation, it's easy to forget that we had the worst wildfire season we've ever had, or that last year it cost Canadians $3.1 billion in insured damages just due to the impacts of climate change. So, when you look at that number versus a carbon tax number, it's kind of easy to see why so many economists do support the carbon tax. I think it's hard to keep together all the information we have. And then a lot of the times, how things are presented. Something I thought was interesting is the idea of floodplain management, and that there's different ways that can be introduced, not to say you are on a floodplain, we are no longer going to insure you, but in saying you are on a floodplain. Moving forward, these are the risks that might be presented to you. And those are two very different conversations with the same information. So I think that's what's going on. And I think also we're in a time too with distrust, especially of government, which Peter also mentioned, that I think we need to have a little bit more hand holding in how everything comes together, like why the carbon tax, how it works, where it goes, and not just the government is asking for more money, especially in a time when we're having an affordability crisis. So I hope I answered your question there.
Yeah. Bob, in your presentation emphasizing creativity, and of course we've had within music, there's the whole folk song tradition and Pete Seeger and Negro spirituals going long before that. Um, uh, in many ways, the arts have been used behind social justice. Picasso and the Guernica, really a passion through the arts for a better world. That, however, though, then meets the big battalions of the power with those who've got money, masses amounts, and seem to be impervious to the consciousness raising that art brings. Um, you, in your experience, the use of art to raise consciousness, it works? Do we need more of it? How can it work better?
Yeah, I think the arts are one piece of the puzzle, and as Emily talked about, the interplay between good research, formulating policies, protest, as Peter talked about, being on the streets. There's no single precipitating factor. I think, to my mind, historical change happens when a host of elements come together, and in many ways, it is unpredictable. Uh, but the arts, I think, go in two directions. You're right. I don't think the arts change the consciousness of those in power that much. I think a crucial uh, gift of the arts is to sing to the choir. Those who engage in opposition, justice seeking, it's a wearying task, frustrating, as you pointed out, with the sense that things are repeatedly steps back rather than forward. And I think the one of the key roles of the arts is to sustain a vision, as well as to get outside the immediacy, to speak to the heart, to the imagination, uh, and in an ongoing way to sustain uh, the choir, the protest, the work. Uh, and yes, the hope is that it will change minds of also of those who are in between, the 10% or whatever, between those who might be strongly committed in one way or the other. And I think the arts could work there. And I think humor has a particular role, insofar as the tone of the arts is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And so therefore, I think you need a variety of arts with a variety of tones, and you're speaking in several different directions. But perhaps most important of all is to sustain the protesters and their vision, and to nurture them along the way with arts as companions. Billy Connolly, a leader of the Easter Rebellion of 1918 in Ireland, once said, you cannot have a mass movement if you do not have songs that everyone can sing. And I think, broadly speaking, the arts help the movement protesters sing and sustain spirit in the midst of the ongoing frustration.
And could I
Thanks.
add to that, Tom?
Jump in.
Yeah, okay. I love what you just said. And I think also the arts makes the messaging of protests much more inclusive and intergenerational, especially in places like Toronto, where we have a very multicultural society. And when we start to talk about climate change, we can forget that people might not know what carbon capture truly means or what CO2 really is. So I think like the idea of, I've seen often like a world on fire is a very global understanding of like, this is bad. So I think that's incredible of how the arts and how it takes messaging years later so we can look back and add on it. Because even I'm familiar with so much of the art of the Vietnam War and like seeing it even kind of repeated now, or Rosie the Warrior, like Rosie the yeah, that's it word. How we still use that at many women's marches.
Right. Peter, Bob mentioned in his opening remarks about protesters themselves being careful about their message and that their activities don't take away from the message and become the story themselves. I mean, not being conspiratorial minded, but there is a danger, is there not, of protests being captured by small groups of agitators, those who are keen for disruption and perhaps not around the issue themselves. I'm going back. You were probably working in Toronto then. I remember when I lived in Toronto at the G20, massive protests against the broader issue of globalization. But there were about 100 folks that are wearing black masks and so on. I went around smashing windows. Never seemed to me to have much to do with the issue of globalization, but we're up to kick out a lot of trouble. And that's a very controversial episode, the G20 and so on. But am I incorrect that there were folks there who had very little to do with the protests and kind of took over a big piece of it?
Tom, inevitably, and I thought Bob did an excellent job of sort of framing out that particularly unique aspect of what I refer to as a dynamic within any protest. You could, for all the right reasons, on behalf of the efforts of the organizers and the efforts of police and other civil actors, whether it's the permitting department of the local municipal council, whatever the case may be, you could have all the right efforts in place and intents, and other people join into that dynamic on the day of the event and change the dynamic very significantly without a whole lot of resource and effort. And so that's always at play, and I think is usually one of, if not the highest risk factors for the majority of time that I was in policing. I think increasingly now you've got the double element of the individual or small group of individuals, whether it's the black bloc that we referenced that used to dominate such dangerous events in the late 90s and 2000s. But now social media is increasingly the agitating factor, and one that can quickly go viral, either by a small event taking place in and around the actual protest, or by just simply something completely made up that has no basis in reality, is a complete fabrication. And again, with the application of AI, can look to the average person as a real occurring aspect of the event. And that can change the dynamic very quickly and change the entire narrative around what could have been a very righteous cause and could have been a very well handled and safe event into something quite different. So that's a factor that's existed forever. The reference you made to the black bloc activities within the G20 is a great example. But literally every single large, small, medium, local, or international protest has that danger attached to it, increasingly because of social media, disinformation, and misinformation campaigns.
But Peter, could I ask a question here? I appreciate the generous portrayal of the police in these matters. With the sensitivity of having meet and greet and such, and I believe that's the case. And at the same time, talking to former police friends and simply looking at what happens on the streets. Former police, the number would complain a shift in police culture, trained in more paramilitary kinds of operations. No longer do you have the police officer, you have somebody wearing a shield, body armor, no eye contact, no face contact, nothing personable about the presence of a row of police officers with a paramilitary gear. And I wonder, at the same time, the degree in which that sets the tone. And there are no shortage of examples and of that experience. So, it's kind of a schizoid culture I'm hearing. There's the intent, that there's certain things in place. At the same time, within policing itself, has maybe the culture changed to, and then you have that complaint that police quite generally seem to be more sympathetic to right-wing protesters and handle them more gently than left-wing protesters. And cases in Britain, cases in the U.S., and even in the Ottawa fiasco in terms of the truckers business. But there seemed to be a certain generosity towards them. Maybe that's just general.
Bob, there's a lot in there. I'll try to remember all the different nuances you threw at me, and if I forget something, please do remind me. I hope I wasn't too generous. I think my most important point in my presentation, I've reinforced it in my questions, the answers to the questions so far, was that the most important factor is the dynamic between the organizers and the police, as well as the other civil actors. So to what extent can organizers and the police and the municipality or province or state in question demonstrate in every aspect, not just in word, but in deed, not just at the start of the event, but all the way through post-event, a level of trustworthiness, a level of willingness to communicate, collaborate may not be the last word, but the best word, but coordinate efforts to increase the likelihood of not just a lawful, but a safe event for all persons involved. Safety for the protesters, safety for the general public in and around the events, and yes, safety for the police officers and other city employees, provincial employees, as the case may be, federal employees. A lot of that has been taken away, and I don't want to overemphasize social media, but a lot of that direct dynamic has been taken away by the overarching impacts of social media. There are many good aspects, to be clear. Social media has created a exciting and enabling and necessary megaphone for disenfranchised and disempowered individuals to be able to get their message out unfiltered by politics, unfiltered by media, unfiltered by police representatives. So it is not all a negative. There's absolutely a huge positive in that aspect of social media. And I hope the positives will win out over the negatives. But come back to, I think, your material point. Are the police perfect? Far from it. In fact, I spent the majority of my career trying to improve a very imperfect institution in all aspects of policing, and particularly in the area of the promotion of charter rights, human rights, and privacy rights. That is because of many instances where I have seen police officers on the front line, police executives in in the office towers of power and the larger policing and justice institution failed to protect, never mind promote, charter rights, human rights, and privacy rights. I think we are probably in violent agreement, not in any real disagreement. As I think you said also, real change happens when a host of things come together. Real good protests and real good democracies happen when a whole bunch of institutions and individuals and organizations and causes come together.
Well, I think we can all agree within the police issue that we've been talking about, is that there are a lot of nuances and balances as these folks are trying to do their job. But getting back to the point about, as King and others talked about, that protest is a way of communication. It's a messaging. It's a way that tries to point to injustice. But then at the same time, in losing a message, the way that protesters themselves run their business has tremendous moral implications. I mean, the kinds of Bob talked about using humor and ridicule and so on. But at the same time, we're seeing in many demonstrations currently now with events in the Middle East, almost hate speech on the placards and the screams that are carrying out, that the protesters, it seems to be getting not around the issue, but becoming personal. And certainly that has to, it seems to me, in many of the protests today, we're a long ways away from the Selma or Gandhi's March to the Sea, that intimidation seems to be part of the strategy now, not messaging about a societal need. That it seems to me there's been a coarsening around protesting as well. Any response to that?
I think, oh, sorry.
Jump in.
I think sometimes people lose their audience. Like when you are in a protest and you start to attack other individuals, those people have no influence over the policies that you're arguing against. Going after an individual for very specific reasons, for like their race, their gender, anything like that, that is not going to move the needle and get people together. I think there's a lot of anger, and I think that's I'm not justifying, but I think that's where a lot of this comes from. And also, as was said earlier, the disinformation, it's getting harder to understand and navigate online, especially if we look at most protests are youth-based. So I think we really need to have digital literacy at the core of education too, so that when you see a TikTok, you can understand that it's been taken out of context, or that like this is the wording, or this is the true history of what this word or what this item or symbol actually means.
Good. We're starting to get close to our closing, so I want to go into have another round in the reverse from the first. So we'll start with Peter, and then Bob, and then end with Emily. Again, on what you've heard in the discussion or other points that you would like to make to give you another kick at the can without me necessarily interfering. So Peter, from what you've heard or other points that you'd like to make, please give us a couple of minutes.
I'll just reflect back a little bit. Again, I've really enjoyed the session. I hope others who are online have. Bob's idea of using creativity resonates a lot with me. In fact, on the opposite side of this equation, I used to talk about creativity in policing in terms of being able to establish relationships in communities where there has been a historical context of over-policing and under-service. and encouraging officers to use their hearts as much or more than their minds or their muscles in order to reach out in very creative ways. And we've seen some benefits around that. So I think that holds true across the spectrum. And with a lot of artists in my own personal family's background, including a lot of activists who were jailed themselves for protesting in other countries, I have a great appreciation and empathy for what Bob talked about. Um, Emily's comments around the urgency and yet the fatigue. There are just so many burning issues, so many burning platforms around which people need to leverage in order to make real change. But that is fatiguing. It's fatiguing on all aspects, on the protests, on the organizations around the protests, obviously on the police who are responding to a higher number of protests, and on the patience of the public who I think for the most part support that right, but are dealing with challenges themselves. And how do we find that balance? Come back to the theme of of this gathering that you've curated here, Tom. So rather than anything new, I'm just reflecting on what's been raised. Again, happy to make other contributions, but I'll turn over my time to Bob and Emily.
Good. Joe, did you say there was a question that just came in online?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a question, particular interest to Winnipeggers. Sam Bardeman wants to ask, how would the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike be managed today, especially in light of the truckers' protests that also shut down a city? The 1919 strike might trigger the Emergencies Act today. I think we'll turn to you, Bob, first. You're a Winnipegger. I don't know your knowledge of the 1919 general strike, but it took over a good part of the Winnipeg's downtown.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sam. Yeah. How would it be managed? I mean, that's a question. I think for Peter. I think how it was portrayed was crucial, insofar as it was countered by a citizens committee of 100 who had, a kind of paramilitary organization, which might have appeal now in certain quarters at work. How might it be policed? I'm not sure. I think how might it be enacted? I would think that as then the would-be protesters would have to be clear in their own minds that what they sought was what they had to pursue and live with difficult consequences. I don't think we have uniformity of voices, that we are living again in the midst of many counter voices, and so that the protesters in 1919 were rooted in a certain vision and values. And I think that's fundamental for protesters at this level, to be clear what sustains you, what you seek, at the same time as one's tempted to be overwhelmed by the multiplicity of voices. And if one's own center isn't strong, then I think the sustaining of will and passion and vision is a struggle. And in 1919, many protesters did. They were grounded in a vision of social well-being, rooted in their religious faith as well as political vision.
Well, when we talk about the Winnipeg strike of 1919, my wife is also from Winnipeg, and one grandfather ran the newspaper handout for the strikers, and the other grandfather was on the committee of 100 that Bob referenced. So if we're talking about polarization today, they were pretty polarized in 1919 in Winnipeg. Bob, we somewhat diverted you with the question. Is there any last summing up comments you would like to make before I turn to Emily?
No, I think I was reaching for it in the conclusion, Tom, would be that the amidst multi voices that can be disabling, not that one doesn't attend to as many as one can, but I think it's incumbent on anybody who would sustain action in the social realm is to be reflective and rooted in both a community in one sense of one's own modest place, uh, and the offering that you bring, and you trust that in that process and in the historical process it may find companions and vitality, and you don't know.
Right. Emily, last words to you, very
I think
appropriately.
Thank you. I think the last thing is that we've talked a lot about big protests today, and that some of the greatest things can come out of small protests. We talked about, I think Greta Thunberg is a great example. She's been getting arrested a lot lately on very small protests with very specific asks, asking banks to divest from fossil fuels, asking specific industries to change their funding. So I think what I wanted to end with is that the ethics are a lot in the messaging. Why are you there? What are you fighting for? If you're there to scream and yell, then that is not the true ethic of a protest. And going back to Thoreau, like, what is your morality and what are you trying to change for a better world? And what do you truly believe in? So on that end, I just wanted everyone to know that a protest doesn't have to be 40,000 people wide. It can be 10 people talking to a local MP. It can be your local mom and pop shop and trying to get them to use refilling techniques instead of buying virgin plastic. So on that note, I really enjoyed today's conversation, and I wish we had another hour, but that's just how it is. So thank you so much to everyone.
Well, Thoreau also said, never let your conscience be captured by the legislature. So I
Yes.
want to thank our guests on a very deep and important discussion on a very contentious set of issues. And I just hope that while we work and fight for our values on the streets, we show the same kind of civility and intelligence that this panel has brought to this topic today. Thank you very much on behalf of Massey College.